Welcome back. We're continuing our study of the Middle Ages, and the theologian that we're going to be looking at next follows Anselm, and his name is Peter Abelard. And so let me get right to the PowerPoint here, and we will begin our look at Peter Abelard. Abelard is a very interesting theologian for a number of reasons, as we're going to see, and he had a very colorful life as well. Abelard was born at Les Palais near Nantes. His father wanted him to have a military career. It's a theme we've already seen. Fathers want certain things for their sons, and their sons seem to be more interested in theology. But he knew with his intellect and temperament, he was better suited for the life of a scholar. He studied with some of the most respected theologians of his day, and eventually became one of the brightest intellectual stars of the Cathedral School of Paris. And once again, we've seen that those kinds of schools were fostered under Charles the Great, and they flourished for a number of centuries. The testimony that Abelard was one of the brightest is both his own and some of his contemporaries. But he had a life of basically contentious relations. Although he studied with some of the best minds and best centers of learning of the day, he seemed to have conflict with all of them. Throughout his training, Abelard often found himself at odds with his teachers, and some of whom he had sharp disagreements with. At the completion of his studies, he began teaching, but his arrogance and disrespect for others really never allowed him to stay in one place for very long. He just seemed to have trouble with everyone and everywhere he went. He was an influential philosopher, teacher, and abbot in the Middle Ages. His wit was praised, but his unorthodox approach to theology and his, here it comes, criticisms of many of his contemporaries kept him in near constant trouble. Another author says this: a philosopher, theologian, teacher, Peter Abelard lived in constant turmoil and confrontation with authority. Even later in life, he had conflicts. He wrote a self-serving biography titled The Story of My Calamities, Historia Calamitatum, most of which were his own making. In the monastery of Saint Denis, he antagonized the monks by attacking the traditions, respecting their founder and patron saint. And always, it was he who was right and his enemies were wrong, at least he thought, in his book. And as becomes a history of his misfortunes, he pities himself for all of his troubles. During this time of his life, and this is another thing that he's very famous for, was an affair with Heloise, one of his students. He began an affair with Heloise, a niece of a clergyman who had engaged Abelard to become her private tutor, but eventually they became lovers. Eventually she became pregnant, and after the child was born, they were secretly married. There's some question about whether that actually happened or not, but he claims that they were, whether that was an official marriage or not. But the union further enraged Heloise's family, and she fled to a convent outside of Paris. She never actually joined as a nun, but she lived there. Their affair was doomed from the start. Heloise's uncle, who had engaged Abelard to teach his niece, to say the least, was disapproving, and he even hired some men to have Abelard castrated, and which they did. After that horrific event, Abelard went to live in a monastery, Heloise to a convent, but they continued to write love letters to one another, and those love letters are still published these days as sort of the epitome of how young lovers ought to communicate with one another. Very torrid for the Middle Ages, actually. Moving on. Abelard continued to engage his philosophical pursuits and writings. His philosophical works were concerned in the main with discussions that had been dealt with by Boethius, we talked about him earlier, and Anselm, we just talked about him, and others. His main concerns were the relation of reason and faith, which became really the big topic of the Middle Ages, starting with Anselm and moving on. The use of Neoplatonism in articulating theology, and we've seen that in a number of places already. The use of logic, and he's acknowledged as an outstanding logician, and he wrote on ethics, philosophy of language, metaphysics. You can see that he was quite a polymath. In philosophy, Abelard deserves consideration primarily as a dialectician. For him, as for all of the scholastic philosophers of the 13th century, philosophical inquiry meant almost exclusively the discussion and elucidation of the problem suggested by the logical treatises of Aristotle and the commentaries on those treatises by Porphyry, who was a non-Christian Neoplatonist, and we've talked about him before, and Boethius, who we've already seen. In terms of his theology, in his theological works, Abelard spent much time analyzing the Trinity from a philosophical standpoint. Abelard's most important work, philosophically and theologically in this respect, is Yes and No, written around 1120, in which he participated in the main philosophical dispute of the time over the role of reason and faith in theology. And you can see that his answer was yes and no. And he suggested several seminal methodological innovations, demonstrated the inadequacies of extracts from the Church Fathers. So if they'd have been alive, he would have had a contentious relationship even with them, that were the most important sources for theological work of his day. In Sikh Nan, he listed 158 theological propositions and cited the authorities affirming and denying each one, thus emphasizing the fact that merely quoting authorities was methodologically insufficient. Instead, students had to apply their own intellectual skills to the questions and opinions about whatever the issue was. In theology, for our concerns here, the most important aspect of Abelard's work is his moral influence theory of the atonement. The moral influence theory of the atonement, developed by Abelard, was developed in reaction to the view of Anselm that we saw in Anselm's work Cur Deus Homo. So Abelard is directly in contention, arguing with the Anselmian view of satisfaction. Anselm thought the incarnation necessitated by the fact that our sin is an offense against God's moral dignity, and consequently there has to be some form of compensation and or satisfaction. Abelard emphasized the primacy of God's love. So Anselm, God's holiness, his justice, his honor. For Anselm, the most important attribute of God was God's love. Abelard insisted that Christ did not make some sort of sacrificial payment to the Father to satisfy his offended dignity. He denies exactly what Anselm was saying was the motivational cause or purpose for the Trinity, or for the atonement. So rather, for Abelard, Jesus demonstrated to humanity the full extent of God's love for them. It was humans' fear and ignorance of God that needed to be rectified. This was accomplished by Christ's death. So the major effect of Christ's death was on humans rather than God. So God's not being satisfied. He doesn't need to be satisfied. He's just love. And the problem is that humans fear God and are ignorant of God and need some way to know God's love for them so that they will understand who God is for them. And that's Abelard's theory of the atonement. This is why Christ came. This theory emphasizes the primary effect of Christ's death on humans and sees Christ's death as a demonstration of God's love for us, which should cause us to respond in love for him. The problem with this theory is that it misses the seriousness of sin, as well as downplaying God's righteous wrath. and really has no connection to the Old Testament sacrificial system that foreshadows and informs Christ's death on the cross. And so it's seriously deficient biblically and deficient theologically as well. Although it has had a pretty lasting influence, not during his day, but at the rise of liberal theology in the 19th century. They reached back to Abelard and said that the whole point of the atonement was so that we would know the love of God. The problem is that's partially true. The atonement is there. Christ's death on the cross certainly shows us the love of God. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son. But it also shows us how much God detests sin, hates sin, and that sin must be atoned for. There must be a payment for it. So an example of how you can get some bad theology by emphasizing and overemphasizing one part of good theology. Abelard was a highly gifted man, as we've seen, and apparently had some natural magnetism, at least to Heloise and others. His teaching set the course of philosophical thought for the remainder of the Middle Ages, so people kept dealing with him on the philosophical level, but unfortunately, as 1 Corinthians 8:1 says, knowledge puffs up, and Abelard's pride was his downfall, and certain parts of his theology were certainly at least questionable. Abelard, was the main representative of a new school of speculative theologians, or scholasticism, that prepared the way for Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century. So along with Anselm and others, as we're going to see, Abelard paved the way for medieval scholasticism, and we'll be looking at scholasticism in the next or a future lecture. Well, we have finished for this particular series of lectures using this particular set of notes, as you have seen, and we will pick up with the next set of notes and in the next set of lectures when we return.